Greetings, everyone. It's time for some more chapters of The Secret of the Indian. We are nearing the end of the book. We're on chapter 15, and I believe there's a total of 19 chapters once you count the epilogue. So, let's get right into it. Chapter 15, Interrogation. Mr. Johnson kept his hand on Omri's shoulder all the way to his office, as if he thought Omri would twist free and run for it if he didn't hold on to him, and he might have done it, too, if he hadn't been half paralyzed, at least mentally, from apprehension. He knows. Those were the only words in Omri's head. What was he to do when the interrogation began, as it would in a matter of moments? Lie, deny everything? Okay, but what if Mr. Johnson thrust him through the door of his office, followed him in, and closed and locked it behind him? Then he walked behind his desk, but he didn't sit down. He leaned forward, and he rested his knuckles on the desk and glared hypnotically into Omri's eyes. "Now, Omri," he said in a clear, deep voice, which he used on only the most solemn occasions, when someone had done something expulsion-worthy. "You know what I have to say." Omri swallowed and stared at him the way a rabbit stares into a car's headlights as they bear down on him. "You haven't forgotten that day last year," he said, "any more than I have. The day that you and Patrick were sent to my office for talking in class. The day I went home early because I supposed I was ill, having seen something I believed I couldn't possibly have seen. You remember all that, Omri, don't you?" Omri felt his head nod. "What I thought I saw," the headmaster continued slowly, "was two tiny living people in the palm of a boy's hand. They moved. One of them was dressed as a Red Indian." "It's not right to say Red Indian," Omri heard himself say in a strangled voice. Mr. Johnson jerked his head back. "I beg your pardon." "They don't like it," Omri pursued helplessly, hardly knowing what he was saying. "You should say American Indian or Native American." "I have always said Red Indian, and I shall continue to say Red Indian," Mr. Johnson was suddenly shouting. "I say I saw a Red Indian, a tiny little one, and another figure as well, and they were alive. I spent weeks trying to convince myself I hadn't seen them, that I'd been overworking, and in the end I did convince myself, almost. Until this morning, when I heard you read your story," he went on, leaning even closer so that Omri backed a step. "It all came back to me in a flash, and I knew I was not imagining things after all. I ought to have had more faith in my strength of mind. I ought to have known I am not a man to imagine things." His voice dropped, and his shoulders slumped. "I must confess, it's a relief in a way. That's what it is, a relief." He took a deep breath and allowed himself to sit down. Omri was left standing in front of the desk. His knees had gone woolly, and his face felt cold. "Now then, my boy," said Mr. Johnson more calmly, "let us take a new starting point. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio." "Who?" croaked Omri. "As Shakespeare says, I saw what I saw. They were real. They are real. That is the truth, is it not?" Omri stood dumb. He shut his mouth on lies and truth alike, and just stood there silent. Mr. Johnson was thinking. A year ago, on the day in question, he had browbeaten Patrick into showing him the little people by means of a threat, to telephone Patrick's father. It had worked then. Perhaps it would work now. "Omri, if you will not tell me what I wish to know, I shall have to get your parents' cooperation." Omri's eyes leaped to the telephone. His mind, numb before, suddenly burst into activity. He had not locked his bedroom door because he couldn't. It only bolted from the inside. The cupboard was there. Boone was there. Matron was there, and so were a number of Indians, unprotected and alone, not to mention Patrick in a deep coma inside the chest. If Mr. Johnson phoned home, his mother or his father would answer, and the first thing they would do was to go up to his room, if they believed it. But they wouldn't. How could they? Looking at Mr. Johnson, Omri saw the same thought come into his mind. Mr. Johnson was not a man who enjoyed looking a fool. "Go ahead and phone them," said Omri. The trap shifted. It was not Omri who was caught in it now. Mr. Johnson drummed with his fingers on the desk, looking at the phone, inwardly rehearsing the conversation. No, he must get the boy to admit the truth first. But how? Just at that critical moment, fate intervened. The phone they were both staring at began to ring. They jumped. Mr. Johnson, recovering himself, answered, Hello? Yes, the headmaster here. He listened, and his face changed. His eyes flashed to Omri, and his eyebrows went up. Yes, he is. He's with me now, as it happens. He covered the phone with his hand and said grimly, It's your mother. Well, what does she want? He didn't answer, just handed the receiver to Omri. Mum? Omri, where's Patrick? Omri's heart plummeted to new depths in his chest. Patrick, Yes, darling, where is he? I've got his mother here, frantic. Emma's with her, and she's been no help at all. Now, come on, out with it. Where is he? I'm not sure, stammered Omri, which wasn't precisely a lie. There was a silence from the other end, and then, Omri, let me speak to Mr. Johnson. Dumbly, Omri handed the phone back, and listened as well as he could, with the blood still pounding in his ears. Yes, Johnson here. Yes, I see, yes. I remember Patrick very well. His eyes were narrowed with suspicion as he looked at Omri. You want Omri to come home? No problem about that, he said smoothly. In fact, I'll bring him myself. Oh, no, cried Omri before he could restrain himself. Oh, yes, said Mr. Johnson. He hung up the phone deliberately and rose to his feet. Come along, my boy. My Porsche is outside. You can direct me. Omri directed him to his house. What else could he do? His mind was racing ahead. Patrick's mother, his own mother, probably his father, and now Mr. Johnson. They would all be there, all going at him, going at Emma, breaking down their resistance. All he could think of by way of consolation was, thank goodness I sent Little Bear, Bright Stars, and the baby safely back. The figures were still in his pocket. Mr. Johnson parked his nice new Porsche, part of an inheritance, it was rumored, outside the house, under the big old elm that had died in the Dutch elm disease epidemic some years before, but he hadn't yet cut it down. It was a good climbing tree, and Omri in his imagination shinnied straight up to the top of it in a trice. If only he could be there on that branch just above his attic bedroom skylight, he might manage to climb in, bolt the door, get all the little people safely in the cupboard, restore Patrick, all before anyone could get there by the usual route. If only. But Mr. Johnson's hand was back like a steel vice on his shoulder. The front door was opening even before they reached it, and there they all were, waiting for Omri to explain. Chapter 16. Panic. Okay, Omri, where have you hidden Patrick? Where's he, darling? Where's my son? Just wait until I lay my hands on him. Emma's face was actually the one Omri's eyes fastened on. She looked really pathetic. When she saw him looking at her, she gave her head a little shake, which he instantly understood to mean, I haven't told them anything. But they'd obviously been giving her a rough time, and Omri felt terrible about that. The mothers both looked as if they were about to pounce on him. His father simply looked baffled, so naturally it was his father he made for. Dad, can I speak to you alone? In my opinion, that would be most unwise, said Mr. Johnson. They all turned to look at him, and Omri saw his father's face tighten. He turned back to Omri. Let's go into the kitchen. Can I come? Asked Emma in a small voice, as if she thought that they would all start up with her again the moment Omri was out of sight. Yes, said Omri. Come on, Em. He really felt sorry for her. She actually seemed to be trembling, and as they entered the kitchen, she dropped something that clattered on the tiled floor. They both bent simultaneously, but Omri got there first. What she dropped was a plastic figure of a girl in red. He thought for a moment it was Bright Star's figure, but it was just an ordinary girl. Before he could return it to her, his father got between him and Emma, so Omri slipped it into his pocket. Now, Omri, you'd better tell me at once where Patrick is. When the brain is pushed to its limits, something always emerges, even if it's the worst possible thing, in this case, the truth. He's in my room, Dad. No, he's not, said his father promptly. We looked. Omri closed his eyes and waited, but there was no more. Presumably, they simply hadn't noticed, or the little people had frozen into stillness. He opened his eyes again. His father was gazing at him expectantly. He's hiding? He's hiding. Hiding? Whatever for? Where? Omri glanced at Emma. In the chest. His father looked incredulous. "Are you having me on, Omri? He can't have been there all this time." I don't know. He was there when I left for school.
But why? What was the idea?"
He didn't want to go home yet. And then his father said the most wonderful thing.
"Well, you'd better run up and fetch him."
Omri's heart bounded with incredulous relief. Galvanized, he rushed to the door, and Emma followed close. "I think I'll come too."
"I think I'll come too," remarked his father.
Omri and Emma stopped dead. No, Dad."
"No?"
"No, I will. We'll go by ourselves." Omri turned and fastened his eyes on his father's. "Please." His father hesitated.
"This is all very mysterious," he said, not at all lightly. "I hope there's nothing wrong on that you ought to be ashamed of, Omri."
No, Dad."
"Okay, well, go on, but remember, we're down here waiting, all of us, and if you're not back with Patrick, PDQ, I'll be up there after you."
They raced past the little knot of adults in the hall, up the stairs, two at a time, all the way up to the attic. Omri's chief fear now was that after more than 24 hours, Patrick would have come to some harm, wherever he was. What if, when they brought him back, he was hurt, or even... But it was useless to speculate. The vital thing was to get him back. But first, Omri had to hide every bit of evidence of the magic. The second they got into the room, he bolted the door, and he made for the seed tray. "Give her back!" He turned, and Emma was standing by the cupboard. "What?" "I put her in myself." Put who in?" "What are you talking about?" He panted. "It's the end, isn't it? You're sending them all back now, and you won't do any of it again, because the grown-ups are near to finding out, and it's got too dangerous." Omri looked at her. Her face froze him. She was Patrick's cousin, and now he saw a likeness. She had the same look Omri had seen on Patrick's face so many times. And when he'd made up his mind to do something outrageous...
"What are you on about?" he asked sharply.
"I picked out that girl from my model set, and I'm going to make her real, and I'm going to keep her forever." Omri almost pushed her out of his way. "You're mad," he said shortly. He was still breathless from his run, and from stifled panic. His brain wasn't working well, and he couldn't cope with this new threat. He bent to the entrance of the longhouse. Matron! She emerged. Her headdress was all bent, which happened only when she was thoroughly flustered. "My dear!" she cried, her hand on her thin chin, as if to restrain her heart from leaping out of her chest. "I thought you and Patrick were giants, but some people came into the room who were even bigger than you. I think you were looking for something, and I ducked back into the longhouse the second I saw them, and I ordered all my patients to keep absolutely silent. Luckily, the giants only glanced around once, and then went out again. But oh dear me, it was a bad moment." "Oh, you did the right thing, matron. Now I have to send you back."
"Well, not a moment too soon, and I think I can fairly say I'm leaving all my patients well on the road to recovery. How will you send them back? The non-ambulatory cases?"
"Don't worry. I thought about that. When the chest was empty, he would just put the whole seed tray, complete with longhouse and occupants, in it, and that way he wouldn't have to move the injured Indians individually. But he had thought that he had better send Matron back through the cupboard in case she wound up in the wrong place." Matron stepped gingerly onto Omri's hand and knelt down to keep her balance as he airlifted her to the cupboard. She was looking at him closely. "My boy."
"Yes?"
"You look worried. Am I wrong in thinking that something has happened to change the situation radically?" "You're not wrong, Matron. I'm afraid I won't be bringing you back again." She stepped off his hand into the cupboard, and she cleared her throat loudly. "Well, I can see there's no time for prolonged farewells." She straightened her uniform skirt and checked her pockets to make sure that she had all of her bits and pieces. Her hand strayed once to her cap, and Omri thought that he saw her furtively wipe her eyes with the tail end of one of the floating ribbons attached to it. He knew that he would have felt tearful himself if it were not for his desperate preoccupations. "You've been absolutely wonderful," he said. "I'll miss you," he said even more sincerely.
"Oh, pish, push, tush, and likewise."
but she choked on the last word and simply put out her hand to touch the tip of his finger, which he extended to her. "You'd better hurry," said Emma. "Here, let me do it." And before Omri knew what was happening, she had shut the door with a thump and turned the key, and Omri stood silent, his heart beating, feeling the pressure of time, of all the grown-ups waiting downstairs, and realized that he was putting off the moment when he would open the chest. Then he was aware that Emma was standing there with the key clutched in her hand. "Now, I want my red girl," she said. "You're not going to bring anything to life now," Omri retorted. "I can't let you. And if you can't see why not, then I just wish I'd never let you in on it." Emma's hard, almost Tamsin-like look softened. "Please, Omri, just give her to me, all right? I won't do anything. Just let me have her." Omri reached into his pocket. "Right, well, give me the key." There was a moment, a bad moment, when he thought that she was going to refuse, and God, this was scary. The very people you trusted most could become like strangers in their longing for a little person of their own. It was worse than the way people behaved over gold. If Emma could frighten him like this, what would happen if the grown-ups ever... And then suddenly an awful thought struck him, and he stiffened with horror. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson knew. He was downstairs now, and there was absolutely nothing to stop him from blowing the whole secret wide open. That was what he had come for, and that was what he would do. No sooner had this thought surfaced than he heard something. Emma heard it too. Both their heads snapped around to face the door. "They're coming up here, all of them," she breathed. "Oh, God," whispered Omri, closing his eyes in despair. He's told them." All right, guys, the next chapter is called Chapter 17, The Big Blow. We'll be reading it next week, and since this was a short week, we'll just do those 2 chapters you just listened to, okay? And next week, that'll be the end of the book. We will finish it up. Take care. Bye.